The sheriff had the foresight to call Mr. Grubway and told him to prepare for a group of people who would need to be held back from the scene of the crime. Sheriff Jones needed to preserve what evidence there may or may not be. Mr. Grubway fired up his International Harvester tractor and made it to the cornfield in about 5 minutes. It was just enough time to frustrate a traveler who had the misfortune of ending up behind the tractor. Mr. Grubway never pulled over for anyone. He once made a family of 4 follow him for half an hour disregarding the angry horn, death threats, swear words, and the middle finger finale. Mr. Grubway had a shotgun similar to the one owned by Bobby's grandmother, and no one doubted his ability or desire to shoot them. The crowd of men and women stayed back well beyond the original perimeter around Mr. Walensky set up by Bobby, which was now guarded by one of the best shooters in Fort Anne. To further ensure the borders would not be breached, Mr. Grubway brought the 4 horsemen. A unique name for 4 highly trained German Shepherd police dogs Mr. Grubway had attained a month prior to help protect his farm from illegal activity. A dog was positioned on each side of the perimeter, and anyone who dared come close to the site was met with angry teeth and very loud growling, with a promise of a bite for those who failed to heed the warning. It just so happened Shep was from the same litter. Shep was the runt of the litter, but Shep was the friendliest of all. Mr. Grubway was a loner, but he was loyal to the sheriff due to the fact that the sheriff had helped Mr. Grubway solve the series of cow-tipping ceremonies. The boys had tried cow-tipping, but found out the hard way that it wasn't easy or fun. The cow-tipping ceremonies involved a group of seniors from Hudson Falls who would go out drinking on Gear Road, and then they would venture back to the country roads of West Fort Anne. They discovered the most beautifully cared-for cows in Washington County. Not only were they given lush grass by Mr. Grubway, but he would play classical music in their stalls. They were given the finest grains, and he devised a mechanism he called a cow wash, which enabled the cows to take a bath every night except in the winter when they came back from the fields. The senior high school students had discovered you could sneak into the barns late at night. One boy had read in Mad Magazine about tipping cows in the night, and the boys became obsessed with the idea of doing it. It looked so easy in a magazine. They quickly formed a club called the Sandy Hill Cow Tippers, which was really nothing more than a drinking bunch of idiots. Sandy Hill was the original name of Hudson Falls in the town of Kingsbury. They all geared up for the event by going into the weight room at school, and they consumed as much protein as possible. Every time they ate beef, they would say something stupid like, "I'm taking one more bite for the tipper." This evolved into them electing a master tipper, assistant tipper, and a training tipper. They would group in 3s, and you worked your way up to being a master tipper. The fundamental flaw in their plan was nobody had ever tipped a cow before. But if you had heard the way they talked everywhere they went, you would assume that is all they ever did. The stories in the entourage that had grown around them encouraged the boys to set a date for the best team to go tip a cow. Even though Mr. Grubway stayed to himself, he had heard all about the group and their big claims. Mr. Grubway and the janitor went to school together when he was younger. Based on all the bragging and scheming going on, he wasn't impressed. He assumed his farm could very well be a target, so he got prepared as any shrewd farmer would. He had several meetings with the sheriff, and they worked out a defensive plan. The group always attacked on a Saturday night, and both men agreed the boys would attack on Cabbage Night, the traditional night before Halloween. Mr. Grubway had a good hunch they were coming because they had been driving past his farm for the past week at least once a day. On Frawley Road, you got to know every car and every person that drove by, so the boys stood out. Mr. Grubway had the uncanny ability to identify cars by their engine noises. He even once won a contest against 10 other men at the county fair held in Greenwich. Well, the boys did know that Grubway had an upper pasture with an old barn big enough to hold all of his cows. He worked for a week to make it usable, and on the appointed day moved all of his milking cows there in the early evening. The sheriff knew a mini-golf place in Lake George that had gone out of business. It had a cow theme, and there were all kinds of fiberglass cows to be borrowed. So the sheriff and some of his good old boys rounded up some cows in an old U-Haul and brought them to Mr. Grubway's main barn. A trap of sorts was set, and the sheriff took Mr. Grubway's hand and said, "Now we wait for the bad guys." Mr. Grubway was sipping on his 3rd cup of hot tea when he woke up the sheriff a little after midnight. He heard the barn door creak open ever so slowly. He had always meant to grease those hinges, but there was a great relief in his heart that he had not done it quite yet. Inside the barn, a dopey senior pledge named Cliff Adams, tonight known as Master Tipper Adams, was trying to find his way through the dark, and he saw the silhouette of a huge cow just 9 feet in front of him. He walked with his arms stretched out in front of him, waiting to make contact. Cliff was a germ freak, so he wore a pair of thick work gloves to avoid contamination in the process of pushing a cow over. The boys worked with him all week, pushing over all kinds of heavy things in preparation for this very moment. With the gloves on and no visible light, it would be impossible for Cliff to realize what was about to happen to him. When he was about 2 feet in front of the cow, he ran hard like a football player charging the mooing milk machine across from him. He felt contact with the cow, and it seemed to go over much easier than he had planned. His momentum caused him to fall and ride on the fake cow's side as it tipped over. He could hear the pulley moving as it quickly tipped the huge bucket of tar that was directly over his head. When the warm substance was slowly covering the back of his head, he flipped over only to receive more on his face from a second bucket that released after the first was done. The sheriff had cleverly designed the system of pulleys and motors that delivered enough tar to cover poor Cliff's body, and when he was sufficiently primed, a large box containing feathers from the sheriff's son's feather bed fell upon the body of Cliff Adams. When Cliff stood up, the sheriff and Mr. Grubway were at the door laughing. The sheriff said to Greenway, "You told me your chickens were big, but I declare this is one big bird. Is that Foghorn Leghorn? I do declare." Mr. Grubway was buckled over, gasping for air from laughing so hard. Cliff dove through a side window. He was unfortunate enough to have tried to jump over an electric fence, but he got caught halfway on it. There was a shriek that echoed off the mountain surrounding Mr. Grubway's farm. The sheriff said, "Well, looks like we'll be having fried chicken tonight." He yelled out, "Run, Chicken Little, and tell your friends if they ever come back here, I will lock them up until they're old men." Chicken Cliff was joined by the unknown assistant tipper and training tipper in the field, and they ran as fast as they could. Mr. Grubway and the sheriff continued chuckling and recounting the incident for about 25 minutes. Cliff never made it into the Sandy Hill Cow Tippers Club. He did get a whipping from his father with a branch from a tree, and every time he walked by the popular kids in school, he could hear a clucking sound of some kind. The boys of Sandy Hill never returned to Mr. Grubway's farm, as they knew Sheriff Jones was a man of his word. Mr. Grubway was indebted to Sheriff Jones, and he protected the sheriff's interest in the cornfield. He kept looking back at the two legs in disbelief. They were a deeper shade of blue and much stiffer now. There were several birds sitting on them now, and one was pecking at some popcorn stuck in the tread of the shoe. Coach loved his popcorn. One of the dogs sniffed one of the coach's legs and peed on it. The crowd laughed. Sheriff Jones pulled up in his car with its lights flashing. The only other time the lights flashed were for accidents or a traffic stop just outside of town. This felt like real official business, and he was sure he'd be on TV again. It'd be one of the 3 stations out of Albany, New York. He'd already leaked the story through an anonymous caller, and he knew they were all on their way. Yes, all 3 stations. Thankfully, he'd just gotten his hair cut. This was his moment. Unlike the Johnny fiasco, he was not going to mess this up. All right. Everybody listen to me. I know this. The sheriff caught sight of the 2 legs and said to himself, "What the?" Allison and Bobby were right behind the sheriff. They stayed close. Bobby was already furiously writing notes in his notepad. Sheriff Jones was so taken by the scene that he didn't even notice them. Shep went up and sat by the other German shepherds. They all looked quite regal at the moment. The sheriff yelled out, "I need everybody to get back except Mr. Grubway. I've deputized him to help in this investigation, and I would appreciate your cooperation. Obviously, this is an unusual case, and there's no need to be alarmed. No one here is going to end up in a cornfield like this. It appears to me at first glance to be an isolated incident. I will be at Hoagie's bar tonight to let you know what I know. Since the coach has no next of kin in Fort Anne, you are free to speak, but don't be spreading no rumors. Now go home now while we look this over." Nobody moved. One high school boy got a little too close, and old Grubway slapped him on the head. He yelled, "Get back, you cow tipper!" Everybody laughed. The dogs moved forward and growled. The sheriff wasn't laughing. He screamed, "I said go home!" Still nobody moved. Mr. Grubway got a crazed look at his eye and fired his rifle in the air. He said, "The bullet will be coming down shortly." Everybody left quickly except the sheriff, Mr. Grubway, Allison, and Bobby. The sheriff smirked and asked Grubway, "Blanks?" Mr. Grubway said, "Yep." The sheriff shook his head and looked at Allison and Bobby. "You two go home." Bobby protested. "I found the body first. I might have valuable information. Plus, I know the news folks are coming because somebody told me they're blabbing about it on TV already. I might get to be on TV. I'm not moving, and neither is Allison. Bobby wasn't sure where the part about Allison came from, but they had developed a professional relationship due to this murder, and there was strength in numbers. He learned that from his grandpa. He wished his relationship with Allison was more than that. He always thought she was pretty. The first time he saw her in 4th grade, his heart literally fluttered. He got all warm, and his face turned red. He felt like he was losing control. He went home, and his sister accused him of falling in love. She mockingly overemphasized the word love, so it sounded like love. Bobby protested to his parents, who were just smiling at each other and saying nothing. Bobby pretended the mocking was of no interest to him, and his sister got tired of the game that was yielding no results. The sheriff was beginning to feel overwhelmed, but he decided to let it all go. He said, "Okay, you two, just sit here and watch. If I need anything, I will let you know." Sheriff Jones stood for a moment trying to figure out where to start. Unlike Bobby, he had real technical expertise in dealing with a crime scene from classes he had taken in Albany, New York. The problem was nobody ever got killed here before, so the opportunity to use it had never come. The sheriff remembered that it was important to not contaminate the evidence. He was thankful for the original perimeter that was established by Bobby and sufficiently protected by Mr. Grubway. The sheriff had also been a Vietnam veteran. He never talked about anything that happened there. Nobody in Fort Anne mistreated soldiers when they came home. Soldiers were always honored, but unfortunately the good people of Fort Anne didn't go out of their way to help him readjust to a sleepy little town. Many folks suspected the extra drink taken on a Saturday night by the sheriff was medicine to forget, but in the sheriff's mind it was a reward for a long, hard week. He worked hard to suppress unwelcome memories. Sheriff Jones approached the body carefully and immediately saw something on the ground Bobby and Allison had not noticed earlier. Once you got close enough, there was a rectangular piercing of the ground at about a 45-degree angle, and it looked as if the ground had been lightly brushed over with branches of some sort to cover up potential footprints and other markings in the soil. About 4 inches from the rectangular hole, dirt was assembled in a rough semicircular pattern, like it was purposely scattered that way. It looked like a big dirt letter U. The sheriff looked over at the 2 kids and said, "Nancy Drew and Encyclopedia Brown, get over here. What do you make of that mark right there?" Bobby looked down at the U, and he immediately recognized exactly what it was. He smiled broadly when he found 3 other similar marks positioned around the body. He turned to everyone. "I know what it is because I'm a Boy Scout. They are tent stake holes." He proceeded to write the information in his notebook. He had to bang the pen a couple of times because the ink was trying not to work. "Tent stakes?" The sheriff seemed surprised. "Yes, it looks as if we have a square pattern where the stakes were in each corner." The sheriff rubbed his chin. "What do you suppose that was for?" rhetorically asked the sheriff. The sheriff stopped and pondered this. No footprints, no tire tracks, and a body buried upside down. A riddle. The sheriff looked at Bobby and said, "Boy, can you do me a favor?" Bobby looked confused but answered, "Sure, what is it?" Sheriff Jones pointed at Chet. "Can you keep your dog away from the crime scene? Things are a little bit yellow over here, if you know what I mean." Bobby blushed. "Yes, Sheriff.